I never thought anyone would read my journal. It wasn't meant for anyone else. The pages were mine, filled with the confessions I couldn't say out loud, the emotions I kept buried under polite smiles and carefully chosen words. But when I walked into the living room that afternoon and saw Nathan holding it, the blood drained from my face. "Where did you find that?" My voice came out sharper than I intended, startling him. Nathan looked up, his eyes wide with guilt. "It was on the coffee table," he said quickly, holding the journal up as though it were evidence of his innocence. "I didn't know it was yours." "Of course it's mine," I snapped, crossing the room in a few quick strides. I snatched it from his hands, my fingers trembling. He hesitated, his expression softening. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to invade your privacy. I only read a little." My stomach twisted at the thought of what he might have seen. "Nathan," I began, clutching the journal to my chest, like it could shield me from the weight of his gaze. "You shouldn't have." But I stopped when I noticed the look on his face. It wasn't just guilt. There was something else there. Something that made my cheeks flush. He wasn't looking at me like a son should look at a stepmother. He was looking at me like a man who had seen something he couldn't ignore. "I didn't mean to upset you," he said softly. "But the things you wrote." He trailed off, shaking his head. "What about them?" I demanded, though my voice was barely above a whisper. "They're honest," he said, his eyes locking with mine. "And sad. You wrote about feeling invisible, like no one really sees you. Is that true?" The question hit harder than I expected, and for a moment I couldn't speak. Of course it was true. That was the whole point of writing it down, so I wouldn't have to admit it to anyone else. "It's just thoughts," I said finally, turning away from him. "It doesn't mean anything." "It means something," he said firmly, his voice steady but gentle. I felt the tears rising, but I refused to let them fall. "Nathan, please just forget you saw it," I said, my back still to him. "It's personal." "Okay," he said after a long pause. "I'll drop it, but for what it's worth, you're not invisible. Not to me." The sincerity in his voice made my chest ache, and I clutched the journal tighter. When I finally turned to look at him, he was already walking toward the kitchen, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the overwhelming awareness that something had just shifted between us. After my husband passed 5 years ago, the house became too quiet. The silence was deafening at first, but over time, I grew used to it. I filled the days with little rituals to distract myself, tidying up rooms that didn't need cleaning, gardening until my hands ached, writing in my journal late into the night. When Nathan moved back in a few months ago, the quiet was replaced by the sound of his footsteps upstairs, the faint hum of his music drifting through the walls, the clatter of dishes as he helped himself to whatever leftovers I'd made. It was nice, having someone here again. But it was also unsettling. He wasn't the boy I had helped raise. At 24, he was taller, broader, with a confidence that hadn't been there before. His laugh was deeper, his gaze sharper, and the way he carried himself made it impossible to ignore the man he'd become. I told myself it was harmless, the way my heart fluttered when he smiled at me, or the way I lingered too long in the doorway when he was talking. I was just lonely, that was all. It didn't mean anything. But now, standing in the living room with my journal pressed against my chest, I couldn't shake the feeling that Nathan had seen something in me that I didn't want anyone to see. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying the moment in the living room over and over. I kept thinking about the way Nathan had looked at me, curious, almost tender. It wasn't the look of a boy who had made a mistake. It was the look of a man who had seen something raw, something real, and couldn't look away. I wanted to be angry at him for reading my journal, for crossing a line. But more than that, I was angry at myself for letting him see me like that. I had spent years building walls, keeping my emotions neatly contained. I didn't want anyone to know how lonely I was, how much I longed for connection, for someone to really see me. But Nathan had seen me. And the way he looked at me afterward, it made my heart race in a way I didn't want to think about. The next morning, I found Nathan in the kitchen, standing by the counter with a bowl of cereal in one hand and his phone in the other. The sunlight streaming through the window hit him just right, illuminating the auburn in his dark hair, the sharp line of his jaw. He looked relaxed, unaware of the way my chest tightened the moment I stepped into the room. I hesitated in the doorway, gripping the edge of the wall as I watched him. He hadn't noticed me yet, and I debated whether to just grab my coffee and retreat upstairs. But then he looked up, his eyes meeting mine, and there was that look again. Steady, searching, impossible to avoid. "Morning," he said, his voice casual, but the way his gaze lingered made it clear he hadn't forgotten yesterday. "Morning," I replied, forcing my voice to sound normal as I crossed to the coffee maker. My hands trembled as I reached for the mug, the warmth of the ceramic grounding me slightly. "I owe you an apology," Nathan said, setting his bowl on the counter. I froze, staring down into my coffee. "You don't need to." "Yes, I do," he interrupted, his tone soft but insistent. "I shouldn't have looked at your journal. That was wrong, and I'm sorry." His words hung in the air, genuine and unguarded, and I felt the knot in my chest loosen just a little. "I shouldn't have left it out," I said finally, glancing over at him. "It wasn't your fault. But thank you for saying that." Nathan nodded, his expression thoughtful. "For what it's worth, I only read a little. Just enough to know you've been carrying a lot." I stiffened, my chest tightening again. "Nathan?" "I'm not judging," he said quickly, stepping closer. I don't like the idea of you feeling like that. Like you're alone." I turned to face him fully, my coffee forgotten in my hand. "I'm fine," I said, the words automatic, practiced. "You don't have to be," he replied, his voice quieter now. "It's okay to let someone in." The vulnerability in his voice, the way his gaze held mine, it was too much. I looked away, gripping the mug tighter. "It's not that simple." "Maybe it is," he said, his tone soft but unwavering. "You just don't want to believe it." The truth in his words made my chest ache. I swallowed hard, willing myself to keep it together. "I appreciate what you're trying to do, Nathan, but I'm fine, really." He didn't argue, but the way he looked at me, like he could see straight through the walls I'd spent years building, left me feeling more exposed than ever. I turned back to the counter, busying myself with adding cream to my coffee, anything to break the tension. But even as I moved, I could feel his presence behind me, steady and unrelenting. "I just want you to know," he said quietly, "that I'm here. If you ever need to talk, or anything." His words lingered long after he left the kitchen, the quiet weight of them settling into the corners of the room. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky, we found ourselves in the living room. Nathan had put on some music, something soft and instrumental, and the faint strains of the piano filled the space as we sat across from each other. I had picked up a book, more as a distraction than anything else, but I couldn't focus on the words. My gaze kept drifting to Nathan, the way he leaned back in the armchair, his long legs stretched out, one hand resting on the armrest. He looked so at ease, so unbothered by the tension I couldn't seem to shake. But then his eyes met mine, and I realized he wasn't as relaxed as he seemed. "You've been quiet," he said, tilting his head slightly. "Just tired," I lied, closing the book in my lap. Nathan studied me for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "You don't have to keep everything to yourself, you know." I let out a soft laugh, though it sounded hollow even to me. "Old habits die hard, I guess." "You've spent your whole life taking care of other people," he said, his voice steady. "Maybe it's time you let someone take care of you." His words caught me off guard, and I felt my breath hitch. "Nathan?" "I mean it," he said, leaning forward slightly. "You deserve that." I looked away, the weight of his gaze too much to bear. "It's not that simple," I said again, my voice barely above a whisper. "It could be," he said softly. The quiet conviction in his voice made my chest tighten, and for a moment, I couldn't speak. The music played on, filling the silence between us, but the tension in the room was impossible to ignore. I stood abruptly, clutching the book to my chest. "I think I'll head upstairs," I said, my voice unsteady. Nathan didn't try to stop me, but as I turned to leave, he said, "For what it's worth, I see you, and I care about you." I froze, his words echoing in my mind as I gripped the edge of the doorway. I wanted to turn around, to say something, but the lump in my throat wouldn't let me. Instead, I nodded, the motion small and shaky, before retreating up the stairs. That night, as I lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, I couldn't stop thinking about the way he had looked at me, like I wasn't invisible. Like I wasn't just someone who existed in the background. For the first time in years, I felt seen. The sun had just set, leaving the sky a deep shade of indigo, with faint streaks of gold clinging stubbornly to the horizon. I was in the kitchen, slicing vegetables for a simple dinner, trying to lose myself in the rhythm of chopping. The soft murmur of music drifted in from the living room. Nathan's playlist, I realized. His taste in music was so different from mine, but something about the faint hum of it made the house feel fuller. When I heard his footsteps approaching, my shoulders tensed instinctively. After the morning's conversation and his parting words last night, the air between us had felt too thick, too fragile. "Need a hand?" he asked, leaning casually against the doorway. His sleeves were rolled up, and his hair was slightly damp, as though he'd just come in from a quick shower. "I've got it," I said quickly, though my voice sounded thinner than I intended. Nathan stepped into the kitchen anyway, his movements unhurried. "At least let me set the table," he offered, reaching for the stack of plates without waiting for my reply. I wanted to protest, to tell him it wasn't necessary, but the sight of him moving around the kitchen so naturally, as though this were just another ordinary evening, stopped me. There was something comforting about it, even if I didn't want to admit it. "Do you remember the last time we cooked together?" he asked, his tone light but warm. I glanced at him, surprised. "Not really." "Christmas," he said, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You let me help with the stuffing, and I burned the bread cubes." I laughed despite myself, the memory rushing back. "You didn't just burn them, you set off the smoke alarm." "Hey, I was 19, he said, grinning. "Cut me some slack." The ease in his tone, the way his smile reached his eyes, it was disarming. For a moment, I forgot the tension that had been building between us and let myself enjoy the warmth of his presence. By the time we sat down to eat, the house felt quieter, more intimate. The candles Nathan had insisted on lighting cast a soft glow over the table, their flickering light reflecting in his eyes as he poured wine into both our glasses. "To surviving another day," he said, raising his glass. I hesitated, then clinked mine lightly against his. "Cheers," I said softly. The meal passed in comfortable silence, punctuated by the occasional comment or shared smile. I couldn't help but notice the way Nathan watched me. Not in the way one watches out of politeness, but with a quiet, unspoken curiosity that made my cheeks warm. After dinner, Nathan carried the dishes to the sink without being asked. I joined him, drying each plate he washed, the quiet rhythm of our movements oddly soothing. "You don't have to help, I said after a while. "Maybe I want to," he replied, glancing at me out of the corner of his eye. His words were simple, but the way he said them, soft, deliberate, made something in my chest tighten. When we finished, I reached for the bottle of wine still sitting on the counter. "Want another glass?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Sure," he said, his smile easy. "Why not?" We moved to the living room, the remnants of dinner and the faint clink of glasses forgotten as we settled into the space. Nathan took the armchair, his long legs stretched out in front of him, while I curled up on the couch, tucking my feet beneath me. The music played softly in the background, a gentle, almost melancholic tune that filled the quiet without overwhelming it. I sipped my wine, the warmth of it spreading through me as I glanced over at Nathan. He looked relaxed, his head tilted back slightly, his fingers drumming idly against the armrest. "What's on your mind?" he asked suddenly, his voice cutting through the quiet. I hesitated, startled by the question. "What makes you think something's on my mind?" Nathan's lips curved into a faint smile. "You have that look." "What look?" "The one you get when you're overthinking something," he said simply. I let out a soft laugh, shaking my head. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Sure, you don't," he said, his tone teasing but gentle. I took another sip of wine, letting the silence settle between us again. But I could feel his eyes on me, steady and unrelenting, and it made my chest tighten in a way I didn't want to name. "You've been different lately," he said after a moment, his tone quieter now. "Different how?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. "I don't know," he said, tilting his head slightly as he studied me. "Quieter, maybe more guarded." I let out a soft sigh, setting my glass down on the table. "It's just been a lot," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. Nathan nodded, his expression softening. "I get that," he said. "But you don't have to go through it alone." The sincerity in his voice, the quiet warmth in his gaze, it was too much. I looked away, my hands fidgeting in my lap. "It's not that simple," I said softly. "Maybe it is," he said, leaning forward slightly. I glanced at him, my heart pounding. "Nathan?" "I mean it," he said, his voice steady but gentle. "You've spent so much time taking care of everyone else. Maybe it's time you let someone take care of you." His words settled over me, heavy and unrelenting, and I felt my breath hitch. I wanted to argue, to brush it off, but the truth of what he was saying was impossible to ignore. "You shouldn't say things like that," I said finally, my voice trembling. "Why not?" he asked, his gaze unwavering. "Because." I trailed off, unable to find the words. Nathan leaned back slightly, his expression soft but thoughtful. "Just think about it," he said quietly. I nodded, unable to speak. The weight of his words, the way he looked at me, it left me feeling unsteady, as though the ground beneath me had shifted. When I finally went to bed that night, his voice lingered in my mind, his words replaying over and over until I couldn't tell where they ended and my own thoughts began. The next afternoon, I found myself in the garden, kneeling in the dirt with a pair of pruning shears in one hand and a bundle of freshly clipped lavender in the other. The air was warm and thick, with the scent of earth and blooming flowers, a soft breeze offering just enough relief to keep the heat from being oppressive. The garden had always been my sanctuary, a place where I could lose myself in the rhythm of tending to the plants. But today, even the familiar comfort of the soil beneath my hands couldn't quiet the thoughts swirling in my head. I didn't hear Nathan approach until he spoke. "Looks good out here." Startled, I glanced up to find him standing at the edge of the garden, one hand in his pocket and the other holding a bottle of water. He was dressed casually, in a gray t-shirt and jeans, his hair ruffled slightly by the breeze. "You scared me," I said, letting out a soft laugh as I sat back on my heels. "Didn't mean to," he said, stepping closer. "I just thought you might need a break." He held out the water bottle, his smile easy and warm. "Thanks," I murmured, taking it from him. He crouched down beside me, his gaze sweeping over the garden. "You've really got a knack for this," he said, nodding toward the neatly trimmed rows of flowers and herbs. "It's just practice," I said, unscrewing the cap of the bottle. "And a lot of trial and error." Nathan chuckled, the sound low and pleasant. "Still, it's impressive. I can barely keep a houseplant alive." I smiled faintly, taking a sip of water as I watched him. There was something about the way he was sitting there, relaxed and unguarded, that made my chest ache. He glanced at me, his brow furrowing slightly. "You okay?" I hesitated, the question catching me off guard. "Why wouldn't I be?" "You've been quiet," he said, his tone soft but probing. "More than usual." I sighed, setting the water bottle down beside me. "Just thinking," I said vaguely, hoping he'd leave it at that. But Nathan wasn't the type to let things go. "About what?" he asked, his gaze steady. I fiddled with the pruning shears in my hand, my chest tightening. "Life," I said finally. "Everything." He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I get that." There was a pause, the silence between us filled with the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze. "I've been thinking a lot too," Nathan said quietly. I glanced at him, surprised by the shift in his tone. "About what?" "About what I'm doing with my life," he admitted, his gaze distant. "Where I'm going, who I want to be." His honesty caught me off guard, and I found myself setting the shears aside, giving him my full attention. "That's a lot to think about," I said softly. "Yeah," he said, a faint, self-deprecating smile tugging at his lips. "I guess I thought by this age I'd have it all figured out." I let out a soft laugh, shaking my head. "No one has it all figured out, Nathan. Not even people twice your age." He looked at me then, his expression softening. "Do you?" The question hit harder than I expected, and for a moment, I didn't know how to answer. "No," I said finally, my voice quieter. "I've been pretending for a long time, but no, I don't." Nathan leaned back slightly, resting his hands on his thighs as he studied me. "It's funny," he said after a moment. "I always thought you were the one who had it all together." I let out a shaky breath, my chest tightening. "I've been faking it for years," I admitted, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "After your dad passed, I didn't know what else to do. I just kept moving forward, because stopping wasn't an option." Nathan's brow furrowed, and he reached out, his hand brushing lightly against mine. The touch was brief, almost tentative, but it sent a shiver up my spine. "You don't have to fake it with me," he said softly. The sincerity in his voice, the quiet warmth in his gaze, it was too much. I looked away, my hands trembling as I reached for the lavender beside me. "It's hard to stop," I whispered, "when it's all you've ever known." Nathan didn't say anything right away, but when I looked at him, his expression was steady, unflinching. "You deserve to feel like yourself again," he said. The weight of his words settled over me, heavy and unrelenting. "I don't know who that is anymore," I admitted, my voice trembling. His hand found mine again, this time lingering. "Then maybe it's time to find out." I stared at him, my chest tightening as his words hung in the air. The world around us seemed impossibly still, the only sound the faint rustle of the wind and the pounding of my own heart. For the first time in years, I felt like the walls I had built around myself were beginning to crack. The house was quiet by the time I came downstairs, the kind of deep stillness that only comes late at night. I had been tossing and turning for hours, my thoughts too tangled to let me sleep. The day's conversations with Nathan kept replaying in my mind, his words, his touch, the way he had looked at me in the garden. I told myself I just needed a cup of tea to settle my nerves. But the truth was, I was restless, pulled by an unease I couldn't shake. The dim light from the kitchen was soothing as I stepped inside, the cool tile grounding me. I moved automatically, filling the kettle with water, but the sound of footsteps behind me made me freeze. I turned to find Nathan standing in the doorway, his hair mussed and his t-shirt slightly wrinkled, as though he hadn't expected to see anyone awake. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked softly. I shook my head, reaching for a mug. "No, you?" "Same," he said, stepping into the room. There was a hesitation in his movements, like he wasn't sure if he should stay or go, but he finally leaned against the counter, his gaze settling on me. I avoided his eyes, focusing on the task of preparing tea, but I could feel his presence, warm and steady, filling the room. For a while, neither of us spoke. The faint hum of the kettle filled the silence, and I felt my pulse quicken, my hands trembling slightly as I busied myself with the tea bags. "Can I ask you something?" Nathan said suddenly, breaking the quiet. I glanced at him, startled by the seriousness in his tone. "What is it?" He hesitated, his brow furrowing as he searched for the right words. "Do you ever feel like you're not living your life? Like you're just going through the motions?" His question caught me off guard, and I turned fully to face him, the kettle momentarily forgotten. "All the time," I admitted, the honesty surprising even me. Nathan nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I've been feeling that way a lot lately," he said, "like I'm stuck in this loop, trying to be what everyone expects me to be, but it's not enough." The vulnerability in his voice, the rawness of his confession, made my chest ache. "It's hard," I said softly, "letting yourself admit that, even to yourself." He looked up at me then, his eyes steady and unguarded. "What about you?" "What about me?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Are you happy? You happy?" he asked, his tone gentle but insistent. The question hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words caught in my throat. Was I happy? Did I even remember what that felt like? "I don't know," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Nathan pushed off the counter, taking a step closer. "You deserve to be," he said quietly. I let out a shaky breath, my chest tightening as his words sank in. "It's not that simple, Nathan," I said, looking away. "Why not?" he asked, his voice soft but firm. "Because it's not just about me," I said, shaking my head. "There are expectations, responsibilities, people depend on me." "And who do you depend on?" he asked, the question cutting through me like a knife. I stared at him, my breath catching as the truth settled over me. For years, I had carried everything on my own, never allowing myself to lean on anyone. But now, standing here with Nathan, I felt the weight of it all pressing down on me, threatening to break me. "You don't have to do it alone," he said, his voice softer now. I shook my head, tears stinging at the corners of my eyes. "Nathan, you don't understand." "I do," he said, stepping closer. "I see you every day, holding everything together, pretending you're fine when you're not. You don't have to hide that from me." His words broke something in me, and before I could stop myself, the tears spilled over. I turned away, covering my face with my hands, but Nathan was there, his hands gentle as they rested on my shoulders. "It's okay," he murmured, his voice steady and soothing. You don't have to be strong all the time. I shook my head, the tears coming faster now. You don't know what you're saying, I whispered. Yes, I do, he said firmly, turning me to face him. You've spent so long taking care of everyone else, but who's taking care of you? The question shattered the last of my defenses, and I looked up at him, my vision blurred by tears. I don't know how to let anyone in, I admitted, my voice trembling. You don't have to know, he said softly, his hand sliding down to hold mine. Just let me try. The warmth of his touch, the quiet conviction in his voice, it was too much. I felt myself leaning into him, my forehead resting against his shoulder as I tried to catch my breath. For a moment we stood there in the dim light of the kitchen, the only sound the faint hum of the kettle and the soft rustle of his breath. I'm scared, I admitted, my voice barely audible. I know, he said gently, but you don't have to be. Not with me. His words settled over me like a promise, fragile but unyielding, and for the first time in years, I felt the faintest flicker of hope. The storm outside had begun to intensify, rain lashing against the windows and thunder rumbling in the distance. I sat on the couch in the living room, staring at the fireplace, though no fire was lit. My hands rested in my lap, clenched together tightly enough to leave marks on my palms. Nathan was sitting across from me, his elbows resting on his knees, his hands clasped together as he leaned forward. The space between us felt both impossibly small and unbearably wide, every breath filling the room with unspoken tension. We hadn't spoken since the moment in the kitchen, but the weight of it lingered in the air, thick and heavy. You're quiet, he said softly, breaking the silence. I glanced at him, startled by the sound of his voice. So are you. He gave a faint smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. I'm just trying to figure out what to say. Maybe we don't have to say anything, I said quickly, my voice trembling. Maybe we can just let this go. Nathan's jaw tightened, and he leaned back slightly, his gaze steady and searching. Can you? He asked quietly. I looked away, my throat tightening. I don't know, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. The rain outside grew louder, the wind rattling the windows, and for a moment, the sound filled the room, drowning out the silence between us. You're scared, Nathan said finally, his tone soft but firm. Of course I'm scared, I said, my voice breaking. Nathan, it's not right. It's not supposed to happen. Who says? He asked, his tone gentle but insistent. Everyone, I said, my chest tightening. Society, common sense, decency. It's your pick. Nathan leaned forward again, his eyes locked on mine. But what about what we feel? Doesn't that matter? I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. The truth of his question, the raw honesty in his voice left me breathless. Nathan, I began, my voice trembling, this isn't just about us. There are consequences. To what? He interrupted, his voice sharper now. To being happy? To letting yourself feel something real for the first time in years? His words hit like a blow, and I felt the tears rising again, unbidden and unwelcome. You don't understand, I whispered. Then help me understand, he said, his voice softening. I stared at him, my chest tight with emotion. I've spent my whole life doing what I'm supposed to do, I said, the words tumbling out in a rush. Taking care of people, holding everything together, being the person everyone expects me to be. I don't know how to be anything else. You don't have to be anything else, Nathan said, his voice low and steady. You just have to be you, that's enough. The simplicity of his words, the quiet conviction in his tone, it was almost too much to bear. I felt my breath hitch, my hands trembling in my lap. You're asking me to take a risk, I said softly. I am, he admitted, his gaze unwavering. But I'm asking because I know it's worth it. Because I know you're worth it. The tears spilled over then, hot and unrelenting, and I turned away, covering my face with my hands. I don't know if I can do this, I whispered, my voice breaking. Nathan didn't move at first, but then I felt the couch shift as he came to sit beside me. His hand rested gently on my shoulder, his touch warm and steady. You don't have to decide right now, he said softly, but I need you to know how I feel. I need you to know that I care about you, more than I probably should, but I do. His words hung in the air, and I felt my heart pounding, each beat echoing in my ears. Slowly I lowered my hands, turning to look at him. His face was close to mine, his expression open and vulnerable, and for a moment, the rest of the world seemed to fade away. Nathan, I began, my voice trembling. I. But before I could finish, he leaned in, his lips brushing against mine in a kiss that was soft and tentative, as though he were giving me one last chance to pull away. I didn't. Instead, I leaned into him, my hands clutching the fabric of his shirt as the kiss deepened. It was like a dam breaking, all the emotions I had been holding back spilling over in a rush of heat and longing. His hands moved to my waist, pulling me closer, and I felt myself melting into him, my body responding in ways I hadn't felt in years. The room seemed to spin. The storm outside, nothing more than a distant hum, as I lost myself in the warmth of his touch, the strength of his arms around me. When we finally pulled apart, our breaths were ragged, our foreheads resting together. I could feel the heat of his skin, the steady thrum of his heartbeat against mine, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't feel alone. "This is crazy," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Maybe," Nathan said, his tone soft but certain. "But it's real." I closed my eyes, my chest tight with a mix of fear and longing. "What happens now?" I asked, my voice trembling. "We figure it out," he said simply. "Together." His words settled over me like a promise, fragile but unyielding, and for the first time in years, I felt like maybe, just maybe, I could let myself believe in something more. The morning arrived softly, the storm having passed sometime during the night. The sun filtered through the windows in golden streaks, casting gentle light across the living room. I was still on the couch, wrapped in a throw blanket, staring at the remnants of the night. A wine glass sat forgotten on the table, next to the faint imprint of where Nathan's hand had rested on the fabric of the couch. I hadn't slept much. My mind had been too full, cycling through emotions too vast and too complex to untangle. The memory of his touch lingered, as did the echo of his words. "We'll figure it out. Together." The sound of footsteps broke the quiet, and I turned toward the doorway. Nathan was there, his hair mussed from sleep, his t-shirt wrinkled. He paused when he saw me, his expression softening. "Morning," he said, his voice low and tentative. "Morning," I replied, my voice quieter than usual. He hesitated, then stepped into the room, his movements slow and deliberate. "Did you sleep at all?" "A little," I lied, pulling the blanket tighter around myself. Nathan sat down in the armchair across from me, his gaze steady but unreadable. For a moment neither of us spoke. The weight of everything that had happened hung between us, fragile and unspoken. "I meant what I said last night," he said finally, his voice soft but firm. I looked at him, my heart tightening. "Nathan, I know it's complicated," he said, cutting me off gently. "I know there's a lot to think about, but I don't regret it, not for a second." The sincerity in his voice, the quiet conviction in his eyes, made my chest ache. "It's not just about regret," I said softly. "It's about what this means, about where we go from here." Nathan nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I don't have all the answers," he admitted, "but I know how I feel, and I think you feel it too." I looked away, my hands trembling slightly as I clutched the edge of the blanket. "What if this changes everything?" "It already has," he said simply. The truth of his words hit me like a blow, and I felt my breath catch. He wasn't wrong. Everything between us had shifted, the lines we'd both carefully maintained now blurred beyond recognition. "I don't know how to do this," I admitted, my voice trembling. "You don't have to know," he said gently. "We'll figure it out together." The quiet certainty in his voice, the way he looked at me like I was something worth holding on to, it was almost too much to bear. I let out a shaky breath, my chest tight with emotion. "Nathan, this isn't just about us. People would never understand." "Maybe not," he said, his tone steady. "But I don't care about them. I care about you." His words hung in the air, and I felt my defenses crumbling. The walls I had spent years building, now nothing more than fragile glass. "You make it sound so simple," I said softly. "Maybe it can be," he replied. For a moment, the room was silent except for the faint sound of the wind outside. I looked at him, my heart pounding, and for the first time, I allowed myself to really see him. Not as my stepson, not as the boy I had helped raise, but as the man he had become. "I'm scared," I whispered. "I know," he said, his voice soft but unwavering. "But you don't have to be. Not with me." The quiet assurance in his voice, the warmth in his gaze, it was enough to make me believe, just for a moment, that maybe this wasn't as impossible as it seemed. "I need time," I said finally, my voice trembling. Nathan nodded, his expression softening. "Take all the time you need," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." His words settled over me like a promise, fragile but steady, and I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. Later that morning, after Nathan had gone out for a walk, I found myself sitting by the window with a cup of tea, staring out at the garden. The storm had left everything damp and glistening, the sunlight catching on the leaves and making them shine like tiny jewels. The house felt quieter now, but not in the way it had before. There was a different kind of silence, one that felt less like loneliness and more like possibility. I thought about the night before, about the way Nathan had held me, the way he had looked at me like I was someone worth fighting for. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once, a feeling I wasn't sure I was ready to face. But as I sat there, the warmth of the tea spreading through me, I realized something. For the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible. Nathan had seen me. Not the version of myself I presented to the world, but the real me. And even though it scared me, even though I didn't know what the future held, I couldn't ignore the way that made me feel. When Nathan returned, his cheeks flushed from the cool air outside, he smiled at me, and I felt the tightness in my chest ease just a little. "Everything okay?" he asked, his tone light but curious. I nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of my lips. "Yeah," I said softly. "Everything's fine." It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. Everything wasn't fine. Not yet. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like maybe it could be. The story wasn't over, not by a long shot. There were still so many questions, so many unknowns. But as Nathan sat down beside me, his hand brushing lightly against mine, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in years, the possibility of something more. It wasn't what he said, it was how he said it. His breath, warm and deliberate against my ear, sent a shiver down my spine that had nothing to do with the cool breeze wafting through the open patio doors. "I dream about you, Delilah," Nathan whispered, his voice so soft it melted into the din of the party. I froze, gripping my champagne glass tighter as though it might keep me grounded. My stepson, my husband's son, had just spoken words I couldn't unhear, words that lit a spark in me I had no business feeling. He straightened, his expression as unreadable as ever, and walked away, leaving me standing alone near the edge of the room with my thoughts racing. The family dinner had been William's idea, an annual tradition meant to show off our perfectly blended family to friends and colleagues. But perfection was a lie, and tonight, Nathan had shattered the facade. From the moment he came back from college that summer, taller and sharper-edged than I remembered, he'd been a quiet disruption in the household. At 24, he exuded a kind of confidence that blurred the line between boy and man, and somewhere along the way, I'd stopped seeing him as just a stepson. I hated myself for it. I hated the way my pulse quickened when he entered a room, the way my thoughts strayed at the sound of his voice. But none of that compared to the guilt I felt now, standing there, trembling, after what he'd just said. This wasn't supposed to happen, and yet, when I finally dared to glance across the room, I found him watching me, his gaze steady and unflinching. It wasn't a look of regret, it was a challenge. From that moment on, there was no going back. William and I had been married for 15 years. Our relationship was built on a foundation of pragmatism rather than passion. I was his second wife, the younger woman who brought warmth and energy back into his life after his first wife's tragic death. He, in turn, offered me stability, a sprawling house on the edge of town, financial security, and the promise of a life without chaos. It worked for a time. But as the years wore on, I found myself growing restless. William was kind but distant, his attention consumed by his work. He preferred structure to spontaneity, business to intimacy. Our marriage was comfortable, but comfort has a way of dulling the senses. Nathan was 15 when I married William. He was polite but aloof, a boy still mourning his mother and understandably wary of me. I did my best to build a bridge between us, baking his favorite desserts, attending his soccer games, listening when he wanted to talk. But our bond remained tenuous, more polite than familial. When he left for college, I thought the distance would erode what little connection we had. But over the years, he called occasionally, usually to ask for advice or share a small victory. Each conversation felt like a step forward, and I took comfort in the idea that we were finally finding common ground. Then he came home that summer. The night of the party, Nathan arrived late. I heard his car pull into the driveway as I was finishing the final touches on a tray of hors d'oeuvres. "Nice of you to finally show up," William said, his tone dry but not unkind. Nathan smiled in response, shaking his father's hand before leaning in to kiss my cheek. His lips brushed my skin lightly, but the contact sent a jolt through me. I dismissed it as nerves, blaming the tension I always felt at these gatherings. But Nathan's presence was different now. He'd grown into himself, shedding the awkwardness of youth for something more magnetic. His dark hair was neatly styled, his suit tailored perfectly to his broad shoulders. He moved through the room with an ease that belied his age, his deep voice drawing attention wherever he went. I wasn't the only one who noticed. "Your stepson is quite the charmer," one of the guests remarked to me later that evening, her gaze lingering on him. "He must take after his father." I forced a smile, feeling a flicker of something I couldn't name. The moment that changed everything came just after dinner. William was in the study, entertaining a few colleagues with cigars and whiskey. Most of the other guests had migrated to the patio, leaving me alone in the dining room, gathering plates. Nathan appeared in the doorway, his hands tucked casually into his pockets. "Need any help?" he asked, his voice low. I shook my head, not trusting myself to speak. He stepped closer anyway, picking up a stack of plates from the table. As he set them on the counter, he turned to me, his expression unreadable. "You look beautiful tonight," he said, his tone matter-of-fact. I blinked, caught off guard. "Thank you." He leaned against the counter, watching me with an intensity that made my stomach tighten. "I mean it, Delilah. You always do." "Nathan," I began, my voice barely above a whisper. But before I could finish, he stepped closer, his hand brushing mine as he leaned in. "Do you know how hard it is to pretend you're just my stepmother?" His words hit me like a thunderclap, stealing the air from my lungs. "This isn't funny," I said, my voice trembling. "I'm not joking," he replied, his gaze unwavering. "I've tried to ignore it, but I can't anymore. I don't want to." I took a step back, my heart racing. "You can't say things like that." "Why not?" he asked, his tone steady. "Because it's wrong, or because you feel it too?" I opened my mouth to argue, but the words wouldn't come. Because he was right. Somewhere, buried beneath the layers of denial and self-restraint, I felt it too. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. I avoided Nathan as best I could, busying myself with guests and tasks that didn't need doing. But I could feel his gaze on me, a constant reminder of what had passed between us. By the time the last guest left, I was exhausted. William had retired to bed hours earlier, leaving me alone in the quiet of the house. I was rinsing glasses in the sink when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned to find Nathan standing in the doorway, his tie loosened and his jacket slung over his shoulder. "Shouldn't you be asleep?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. "I couldn't," he said, stepping closer. "Nathan?" "Just listen to me," he interrupted, his voice soft but firm. "I know this isn't supposed to happen. I know it's messy and complicated and probably wrong. But I don't care anymore. I've spent years pretending, and I'm tired of pretending." I shook my head, tears pricking at my eyes. "You don't know what you're saying?" "Yes, I do," he said, closing the distance between us. "And I think you do too." He reached for my hand, his touch warm and grounding. For a moment, I let him hold it, my defenses crumbling under the weight of his honesty. But reality crashed down on me like a wave, and I pulled away, stepping back. "This can't happen," I said, my voice breaking. Nathan didn't argue, he simply nodded, his expression pained but resolute. "I'll wait," he said quietly. "As long as it takes." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving me alone in the kitchen with my thoughts, and the unmistakable knowledge that nothing would ever be the same. I spent the next few days avoiding him, retreating into the safe monotony of my daily routine. I told myself it was for the best, that distance would extinguish whatever dangerous spark had been lit between us. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the memory of his voice, his gaze, his touch. It didn't help that Nathan made no effort to hide his feelings. He was careful, of course, never crossing any lines in front of William or the household staff. But when we were alone, his presence was magnetic, pulling me in despite every ounce of resistance I could muster. It happened for the first time late one night. William was away on business, and the house was dark and still. I had been reading in the living room, the only light coming from the lamp beside me, when I heard footsteps on the stairs. Couldn't sleep? Nathan's voice broke the silence, and I looked up to find him standing in the doorway. He was wearing a t-shirt and sweatpants, his hair tousled from bed, but there was nothing casual about the way he looked at me. I forced a smile, closing my book. Just finishing this chapter. He stepped into the room, his bare feet silent against the hardwood floor. It's late. I know, I said, my voice quieter now. Nathan moved to the couch, sitting down at the opposite end. You've been avoiding me. The accusation in his tone made my chest tighten. I haven't been avoiding you, I lied. You have, he said, his gaze steady. And I get it, I do, but it doesn't change anything. Nathan, just tell me one thing, he interrupted. Do you feel it, the way I do? His words were a mirror, reflecting everything I had been trying to deny. I wanted to say no, to end this before it began. But the truth had a way of slipping through, even when I fought to contain it. Yes, I whispered, the word barely audible. For a moment, neither of us moved. The air between us was electric, charged with the weight of everything unsaid. Then he reached for my hand, his touch warm and tentative, as though giving me one last chance to pull away. I didn't. The days that followed were a blur of stolen moments and whispered confessions. We were careful, always watching for prying eyes, but the secrecy only heightened the intensity of what we shared. There was a recklessness to it, a sense of inevitability that made each encounter feel like both a risk and a reward. We met in quiet corners of the house, in the shadows of the garden at dusk, in the dim light of the library after midnight. Every touch, every glance, every word between us felt like a rebellion against the roles we were supposed to play. But secrets are fragile things, and ours was no exception. It started with something small, a forgotten coffee mug left on the edge of Nathan's desk, the lipstick stain unmistakably mine. William noticed it one morning while making his rounds through the house, his gaze lingering on the cup for just a moment too long. Did you borrow Delilah's mug? He asked, his tone casual but pointed. Nathan shrugged, his expression unreadable. She must have left it here by mistake. William said nothing more, but I could feel his suspicion growing, a shadow creeping into the corners of our carefully constructed lives. The first real crack came during a family dinner. William had invited Clara, his younger sister, to join us. Clara was sharp and perceptive, with a talent for unearthing truths people didn't want to share. So Nathan, Clara began, her tone light but probing. How does it feel being back home? Must be strange after all that time away. It's an adjustment, Nathan replied smoothly. Adjustment for everyone, Clara added, her gaze flickering to me. You seem closer to Delilah than I remember. Nathan smiled, his composure unshaken. She's easy to talk to. Is that so? Clara's tone was laced with something I couldn't quite place, and I felt my pulse quicken. After dinner, Clara cornered me in the hallway. You've been distracted lately, she said, her voice low. Everything okay? Of course, I replied, forcing a smile. Her eyes narrowed slightly. You know, William's been worried about you. He doesn't say it outright, but I can tell. Is there something you want to tell me, Delilah? There's nothing to tell, I said, my voice steady despite the storm brewing inside me. Clara studied me for a moment longer before nodding. If you say so. That night, I found Nathan in the garden, sitting on the stone bench beneath the oak tree. He looked up as I approached, his expression a mix of longing and defiance. She's on to us, I said quietly, sitting beside him. She doesn't have proof, Nathan replied. She doesn't need proof, if she keeps digging. I trailed off, the weight of our situation settling over me. Nathan reached for my hand, his grip firm but reassuring. We'll handle it. Together. I wanted to believe him, but doubt lingered at the edges of my mind, a reminder that the walls were closing in. Our recklessness reached its peak a week later. William was out for the evening, attending a charity gala, and the house was ours. We were in the study, the door locked behind us, when I heard the faint sound of footsteps in the hallway. Did you hear that? I whispered, my heart racing. Nathan nodded, his expression tense. A moment later, the doorknob rattled, followed by a sharp knock. Delilah? It was Clara's voice, her tone laced with suspicion. My breath caught, panic flooding through me. "Stay quiet," Nathan whispered, his voice barely audible. But Clara didn't wait for an invitation. The lock clicked open, and the door swung inward. She stood there, her gaze flickering between us, and I knew in that moment that our secret was no longer safe. Clara's eyes darted between Nathan and me, the air thick with unspoken accusations. The shock on her face quickly hardened into something sharper. Realization. "What's going on in here?" she asked, her voice cold and deliberate. I scrambled for an answer, but my mind was a tangle of panic and excuses. "Nathan needed help with something," I stammered, stepping away from him. Clara's gaze didn't waver. "With the door locked?" Nathan crossed his arms, his composure returning faster than mine. "Privacy, Aunt Clara. I'm not a kid anymore." "That's obvious," she replied, her tone biting. I felt my pulse quicken as her eyes lingered on the subtle cues we hadn't hidden well enough. The faint blush on my cheeks, the way Nathan stood slightly too close to me. "I think we should all have a chat," Clara said, her smile tight and humorless. "Let's not make this uncomfortable." We followed her to the sitting room, where she poured herself a drink before sinking into one of the armchairs. She gestured for us to sit, but neither of us moved. "I'll get straight to the point," Clara began, swirling her glass. "I've always had a knack for reading people, and right now I'm reading something very peculiar between you two." "There's nothing peculiar," I said quickly, forcing a smile. She raised an eyebrow. "Don't insult me, Delilah. You know as well as I do that William deserves better than lies." Nathan stepped forward, his voice firm. "Clara, you're making something out of nothing." "Am I?" she shot back, setting her glass down. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like the two of you have a lot to hide." The room fell silent, the weight of her words pressing down on us. "What do you want?" I finally asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Clara leaned back, a faint smile playing on her lips. "I want to protect my brother, and if that means exposing whatever this is, I will." Nathan and I left the room in silence, but the tension between us was palpable. Once we were back in the study, I turned to him, my voice shaking. "She's going to tell him," I said, pacing. "We're finished." "No, we're not," Nathan replied, his tone resolute. "She's already figured it out." Nathan grabbed my arm, stopping me in my tracks. "We still have time. We just need to think." "Think about what? How to stop her?" I snapped. He hesitated, then nodded. "Yes." I stared at him, the implications of his words sinking in. "You can't be serious." "She won't stop, Delilah. She's not like William. She's relentless." I pulled away, shaking my head. "We can't do this. It's too dangerous." "Then what do you suggest?" he asked, his voice low. "We let her ruin everything? Let her destroy us?" I didn't have an answer. The next morning, Clara was gone. William mentioned over breakfast that she'd left early, claiming she had urgent business to attend to. "She seemed off," he remarked, sipping his coffee. I forced a smile. "You know, Clara, she's always dramatic." William nodded, distracted by his phone, but I couldn't shake the unease that settled over me. Clara hadn't made a scene or left a note, but her silence was louder than any confrontation. Nathan and I exchanged tense glances throughout the day, neither of us daring to speak openly. That evening, the first blow landed. William called me into his study, his tone uncharacteristically serious. When I stepped inside, he was sitting at his desk, a folder in front of him. "Close the door," he said. My stomach churned as I obeyed, the sound of the latch clicking into place echoing in my ears. "What's this about?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. William opened the folder, revealing a series of photos. My breath caught as I recognized them immediately. Grainy but damning shots of Nathan and me in the garden, our faces close, our body language unmistakable. "I received these this afternoon," William said, his voice calm but ice-cold. "No return address, no note, just the photos." I felt the blood drain from my face. "William, Don't," he interrupted sharply. "Don't insult me by lying." "I can explain," I began, but he slammed the folder shut, the sound making me flinch. "Explain what? That you've been sneaking around with my son? That you've been making a fool of me under my own roof?" Tears pricked at my eyes as I shook my head. "It's not what you think." "Then tell me," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "What is it, Delilah? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks exactly like what I think." I couldn't answer. Later that night, Nathan stormed into my room, his face a mask of fury. "He showed me the photos," he said, pacing. "He knows. I know, I whispered, my voice trembling. What did you tell him? Nothing. What could I say? Nathan ran a hand through his hair, his frustration palpable. We need to get out of here. Tonight. Leave? And go where? Anywhere, he said, his tone desperate. As long as we're together, it doesn't matter. I stared at him, the weight of the situation crushing me. This isn't a fantasy, Nathan. This is real, and it's falling apart. Not if we leave now, he insisted. We can start over. Tears streamed down my face as I shook my head. I can't leave everything behind. You can, he said, stepping closer. You just have to choose me. The house was quiet, but it was the kind of silence that felt oppressive, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. I sat at the edge of the bed, staring at the packed suitcase on the floor. Nathan's words from the night before still echoed in my mind. You just have to choose me. But how could I? How could I leave behind the life I'd built, the facade of normalcy I'd worked so hard to maintain? Yet the alternative was just as impossible. A soft knock at the door jolted me from my thoughts. I opened it to find Nathan standing there, his expression a mixture of determination and vulnerability. Are you ready? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I hesitated, my heart warring with my head. I don't know if I can do this. You can, he said, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. We don't have a choice anymore. If we stay, he'll destroy us. He's your father, I said, my voice breaking. Nathan's jaw tightened. He stopped being my father the moment he decided to use this against us. He doesn't care about us, Delilah. He only cares about control. His words cut deep, because I knew they were true. William wasn't a man who forgave betrayal, and now that he had proof of ours, he wouldn't rest until we paid for it. Downstairs, I could hear movement, William's heavy footsteps pacing in his study. He hadn't spoken to me since our confrontation, but his presence in the house was a constant reminder of the storm brewing just out of sight. We leave tonight, Nathan said, his tone resolute. I'll take care of everything. You just need to trust me. I wanted to. More than anything, I wanted to believe that we could escape this nightmare and find some semblance of peace. But the weight of what we were doing, the lives we were about to shatter, felt unbearable. What if it doesn't work? I asked, my voice trembling. Nathan stepped closer, taking my hands in his. It will. Because we'll make it work, together. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, we made our move. Nathan had parked his car down the street to avoid suspicion, and we planned to slip out through the garden gate. I crept downstairs, my suitcase in hand, my heart pounding with every step. The house was eerily still, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. But as I reached the door, a voice stopped me in my tracks. Going somewhere? I turned to find William standing in the doorway to the study, his face shadowed, but his tone razor sharp. My breath caught, and for a moment, I couldn't move. William, save it, he snapped, stepping into the light. You really thought you could just walk away? After everything you've done? Nathan appeared behind me then, his presence grounding me. This isn't your choice to make, he said, his voice steady. William's gaze shifted to his son, a cruel smile tugging at his lips. You really think she'll choose you over everything I've given her? She already has, Nathan replied, his words cutting through the tension like a knife. For a moment, the three of us stood frozen, the weight of our choices pressing down on us, and then, without another word, I stepped toward the door, Nathan at my side. William didn't stop us. But his silence was a promise. This wasn't over. We didn't stop driving until the city lights disappeared, swallowed by the dark expanse of the highway. The air in the car was heavy, filled with a silence that neither of us dared to break. Nathan's hands gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles pale under the faint glow of the dashboard. I sat beside him, my suitcase at my feet, my mind racing with everything we had left behind. The house. The lies. William. And Clara. Her words before she left echoed in my mind. If you're hiding something, Delilah, you won't be able to keep it buried forever. I hadn't believed her then, but now it felt like she had known all along how this would end. We stopped at a small motel off the interstate, the kind of place where no one asks questions. Nathan handed me the key without a word, his expression unreadable. Inside the room, the reality of our situation hit me all at once. The walls were thin, the bed creaked when I sat on it, and the air smelled faintly of mildew. This wasn't freedom, it was exile. Nathan sat beside me, his shoulder brushing mine. For a long moment we just sat there, the weight of everything unsaid pressing down on us. "Do you regret it?" he asked finally, his voice quiet. I looked at him, his face shadowed but open, waiting. "Regret what?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Choosing me." His words cut through me, raw and unguarded. I thought about William's face when we walked out, the look of betrayal and fury that would haunt me for the rest of my life. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice trembling. "I don't know if I'll ever stop feeling guilty, but I also don't know if I could have lived with myself if I stayed." Nathan nodded, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I'm sorry," he said, and for the first time since this began, he sounded unsure. "For what?" "For dragging you into this. For ruining your life." I reached for his hand, lacing my fingers through his. "You didn't ruin my life, Nathan. You just made me see it for what it was." The next morning, the weight of what we'd done felt heavier. We turned on the TV in the small motel room to find the news already buzzing with the scandal. William's face filled the screen, stoic and composed, as he gave a carefully worded statement about betrayal and legal action. My stomach turned as the reporter shifted the focus to us, his unfaithful wife and wayward son. The picture they painted was one of disgrace, of shame, of people unworthy of sympathy. Nathan turned off the TV, his jaw clenched. "He's gonna make this hell for us." "We'll survive," I said, though the words felt hollow. "Will we?" Nathan asked, his voice soft but uncertain. I didn't have an answer. Later, as we packed up to leave, I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror. I looked different, older maybe, or just more tired. But behind the weariness, there was something else. Defiance. For better or worse, this was my life now. And for the first time in years, it was mine to decide. Nathan opened the door, the sunlight spilling in around him. "You ready?" I nodded, stepping out into the unknown, leaving everything else behind.